Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Air-Borne, the hidden history of the life we breathe. In this fascinating book, award-winning New York Times columnist and author Zimmer leads us on an odyssey through the living atmosphere and through the history of its discovery. Delighted to say that Carl joins us live on the line now. Good afternoon from us. Good morning to you.
Hello.
Good. Whereabouts are you, by the way, today? Where do we find you?
I'm in Connecticut, a couple hours from New York.
A very nice part of the world indeed. I suppose the thing is that and this is going to sound very, very sort of basic, but we take breathing, we take the air for granted. What is Air-Borne? What's the main sort of thrust of it? What are we discovering with it, please, Carl?
Yeah, when we breathe in and breathe out, hundreds of thousands of times a day, we don't really think that much about what we are breathing in. We just assume we're getting the oxygen we need. And, if you look up in the sky, you think it's just sort of transparent. You might imagine it's basically empty, certainly of life. But the fact is that the air is very much alive. It is filled with a staggering number of organisms. And I mean, not just the birds you might happen to see, but lots of invisible things and millions of species that live all around us, live in the clouds and reach even up to the stratosphere. And they affect the balance of nature, and they have a huge influence on our own health.
I suppose one of the things is that we are forever saying, let's go to Mars, let's put bases on the moon. But actually, there's still so much of this planet that we don't understand, that we haven't explored. And even now we are finding more things about.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's true. That's true for the land, and it's true for the oceans. We've barely started to explore the ocean floor, and which is full of life as well. I would actually say that the atmosphere is the least understood of these kind of three domains of life. And part of the problem is it's just so big. I mean, it's just the biggest physically, space where life can be. And it's just really, really hard to study. And scientists have struggled for centuries to try to figure out what's up there.
This is the hidden history of the life, that we breathe. I mean, how did people sort of first realize that, and again, layman's terms, there was stuff up there rather than just being sort of fluffy clouds and blue going to dark the further out you got?
So the clues came very slowly at first, and there were signs that there was life in the air, but people didn't know how to read it. So, for example, the Greek poet Homer would write about what he would call blood rain, and sometimes you see mentions of blood rain in sort of medieval histories, and people would say, "Oh, that's just some strange superstition." But in the 19th century, a microbiologist said, no, actually, that is reddish bacteria mixed with dust that's coming down out of the air. Charles Darwin, in the 1840s, he was sailing across the Atlantic on the Beagle, and a dust settled on the ship, and he scooped up some of the dust and took it home. And then years later, a scientist took a look at that dust and discovered that there was mixed in with lots of microbes. So these were microbes and they were microbes that live on land. And so they must have traveled probably from Africa all the way into the middle of the Atlantic. So you had those indirect clues. It really wasn't until the 1930s that scientists could actually go up there in planes or balloons that went to the stratosphere and actually start to catch things high in the air. And that's when this world, what scientists call the aerobiome, really started to come to light.
I mean, because how do you know if you caught anything? I mean, again, I'm just trying to think. You go up there in a pressurized suit, presumably, because you're up at you're not going up in a jet airline. You're going up in pretty much an open aeroplane, open balloon. But are you taking a test tube? How are you just having a big sweep? I mean, how do you actually do it, Colin? I'm fascinated.
Well, when people were starting, it was pretty crude. So, in the 1930s, you'd have these, pretty crazy scientists who would be sitting in open cockpits, and they'd basically have petri dishes stuck to handles, and they would wave them around as they flew 10,000, 15,000 feet in the air, and they would come back down, and then they would take those petri dishes to their labs and incubate them to see if they had caught anything. And they did. They would, after a few days, they would see things growing, things like fungi, for example. There's lots of fungi in the air, lots of spores. But then today, when scientists are looking for life high in the air, they might equip, one of these very high altitude planes with basically a probe on the side of it. So it just sucks in air and then traps any living thing that comes through it. And that sort of method and methods like it have, been able to actually trap living things as high as about 20, 25 miles in the air.
I'm just thinking perhaps, and this is the way that off a glacier, for example, off a mountain range, something could actually be, because once you get up there, and again, I know very little about this, presumably the jet stream is going to sort of catapult you almost halfway around the world, and that could be a transfer of all sorts of interesting effects, quote unquote.
Yes, absolutely. So it doesn't, but it's, there are things coming up into the air all the time. Every second of the day, there are life forms that are rising up. So on land, it could be the evaporation in the morning that actually that moisture can pull things up and up into the air. A forest fire is very good at this. It shoots it up at high altitude. But even ocean waves, if your listeners go to the beach and they watch some waves crashing, every time those waves crash, they're actually creating tiny droplets that are so small that they don't just fall back into the water or onto the beach. They go up into the air. And if the winds are right, they just get pulled right up, and then they can go up for miles. And once these organisms, these fungi, these bacteria, these viruses, these algae, these lichen, these pollen, and so on, once these things get up, a few thousand feet, they can be carried along literally for days. They can cross entire oceans, and so we have this traffic traveling along these aerial highways every day.
And it's interesting because, you think about invasive species as well. If somebody lands on an island with no natural predators and a cat gets out, or a rat, and it's suddenly everything is devastated. Has there been that sort of effect as well with, microbes landing on another part of the world that then changes the whole sort of biosphere of that area?
Yes, absolutely. And the place where you can see that most strikingly are places in the ocean where a volcano has erupted and has created a new island. So at first it'll be just bare rock. But if you wait a while, if you come back in a few years, you'll start to see that it's coming alive, that there's a living crust on it. So this can be a combination of bacteria that grow crusts or moss or other things. They're not swimming there. They're all flying there. And so that gives you a sense of just how the air has just got this ready supply of life that can, populate a new land.
It's interesting you say that they're not swimming there, because obviously, if I look at history and I think about, plagues, Black Death, whatever, I always think, okay, they're coming on the back of, the Silk Road. They're on ships coming into the Mediterranean, they're hitting Venice or whatever, and it's spreading like that. But of course, that's a pretty I can get my head around that. But if you put something up there that isn't friendly or naturally goes there, then, is it, I'm just trying to think, you talked about, is it the Welleses, William and Mildred, who discovered this? Who tell us a little bit about them and what time frame we're looking at here.
Sure. So William and Mildred Wells were one of these two of these pioneering scientists who studied the living air, the aerobiology, and they were particularly interested in the air that we inhale and exhale together. It's particularly in indoor spaces, because, if one person is sick with, bacteria, viruses in their airway, they may exhale it and other people might inhale it. So they were very concerned that diseases including tuberculosis, measles, influenza, and perhaps a bunch of others were in fact airborne. And they did a lot of pioneering research to show this was the case. And tragically, unfortunately, the scientific community mostly ignored them. And that was a really terrible mistake, and a mistake we paid for dearly during the COVID pandemic, because COVID is among these airborne pathogens.
Well, I mean, was there any, because you talk about sort of Cold War times, and people are looking into all sorts of ways of getting one over. You're thinking about, psychological warfare. There's the use of LSD. And people are talking about, NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical weapons. We're thinking about the delivery of these things, and something like an anthrax, for example, is always seen as, artillery shell dropped from a, horrendous as that prospect seems. Were agencies on both sides worried that something like this might get into the atmosphere, it might get into the air that we breathe, in a more insidious kind of way? Because if you just put it up there and it floats across, I mean, we know about sort of radiation from Chernobyl, for example, but again, most of us hadn't thought that you could sort of release something high up or shoot it high up, and then it would just dissipate gently to the ground.
So starting really in World War II, the United States and also the Soviet Union, and then later other countries, Britain as well, got very interested in this research that I was just describing about aerobiology. These aerobiologists who were discovering that, yes, indeed, there were lots of things flying around in the air. And not only that, but, they were figuring out the physics by which, diseases could spread from one person to another in the air. And they said, let's take all this knowledge and these tools that these scientists have invented, and let's use them to build airborne weapons, and let's weaponize aerobiology. And so indeed, they made, for example, anthrax bombs. So they would, anthrax is not normally airborne. It's in the soil, and animals pick it up when they're grazing, and people can pick it up from contaminated hides or meat, for example. But those spores, if they get into the air and you inhale it, can be lethal. And it was actually called wool sorter's disease, because the spores would be in wool that was handled by British wool workers in wool factories. So, so the United States, the Soviet Union, and other countries have made these anthrax bombs, which are especially designed so that you could release them in the air, say over a city, and those spores would shower down on civilians or on an army, and cause just like massive casualties. And there were other weapons that were invented that were designed to wipe out food supplies, because wheat and many other crops are very vulnerable to airborne disease, their own airborne diseases. They've been vulnerable to them for thousands of years. So in the late 1900s, this was a massive undertaking. There was just tons of this stuff that was being created and stored. And, in the 1970s, the United States and Britain and the Soviet Union actually signed an agreement not to develop these anymore. The U.S. and U.K. destroyed their stocks. The Soviet Union actually went even bigger into biological weapons, and was investigating things like, making Ebola as an airborne weapon as well.
Yeah, I mean, presumably the original scientists, this is as the film would go, you're doing stuff you don't know what you're doing with, the military takes over, you've got these people are trying to understand for the good of humanity, and yet it gets weaponized, which is obviously a little disturbing for a lot of us, because there are sort of natural defenses against things like this, Carl. I mean, the Soviets presumably, it's a huge landmass. They've stuck it somewhere, out of sight, out of mind, somewhere in Siberia, probably.
Yeah, and actually, we didn't really become aware of just how extensive the program was until certain clues came out of the Soviet Union. For example, in 1979, an anthrax production facility had an accident, and then these spores got released into the air coming out of this building, and the wind carried them along. So, suddenly you have this incredible, air biology event where these anthrax spores are drifting along through the air, and a lot of people died downwind of it. There are these real threats. But I would say that, the genesis of this kind of work, was a lot like the nuclear weapons development, where actually, in both cases, certainly in the United States, you had scientists themselves who said, we need to do this. We need to do this as part of our effort to defeat Hitler. So, I focus in my book on one aerobiologist who very willingly joined in. His name is Theodore Roseberry. And, he just said, look, we bet Hitler's going to be doing this too. So we need to get into this race. He had a clear conscience during the war. But then after the war, he was really horrified to see that the United States in the Cold War just actually started making even more biological weapons. And he then became a big opponent of it and helped to push towards a ban of biological weapons.
Because it's interesting, isn't it? There is a revulsion, I suppose. I mean, obviously we had sort of chemical weapons in the First World War with the gases and whatever. Nuclear used because of the horrendous loss of life that could have come had the US had to take the Japanese home islands. But there's something there's almost a moral revulsion to a biological weapon, because it is so horrendous, and there's you can't see gas, you can see nuclear, but for a millisecond and then you are toast. But with a biological, and it's it could be a horrendous process to actually suffer from it or die. I mean, Ebola, anthrax, these are obviously a sort of horrendous diseases, horrendous conditions.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the stuff of science fiction. Literally, from the Andromeda Strain to the movie Outbreak, there's so many movies where, an airborne disease, perhaps either a natural one or a weaponized one, becomes kind of a central player in these science fiction stories. And unfortunately, the United States actually justified its invasion into Iraq in a substantial part with the claim that they were making these weapons. So Colin Powell goes to the United Nations and holds up a vial of powder and starts talking about what would happen if Saddam Hussein had, anthrax that he could unleash. The fact was that when the United States finally got into Iraq and went looking for this anthrax and other biological weapons, they found none, because there were none there. Or Saddam Hussein had been developing them in the past, but there were none there. But we had sort of told ourselves a story that was so powerful that, the consequence was devastating.
And, we're talking about the stuff of science fiction, about outbreaks and, that sort of thing. And of course, within recent memory, we have a pandemic, we have an outbreak, and suddenly everybody became experts on airborne. And from your point of view, Carl, where the reaction was one of shock, it was people didn't understand. And again, as somebody who studies this and knows it and writes about this, what was, how do you put that incredible sort of experience that the world went through in a historical context, and also in a modern context, because of the social media, the political sort of shenanigans that went around it?
So At the start of the COVID pandemic, health agencies in Britain, in the United States, the World Health Organization, they all basically assumed that COVID was going to be spread only in certain ways. So that, it was a respiratory disease, but people would get it on their hands and then they would contaminate surfaces. Maybe if you got your groceries, you should wipe them down. I know I certainly did at the beginning. And also, if you just sort of stayed 3 feet or 6 feet away from other people, that would be fine because they wouldn't sneeze in your face, and that was it. But there was a small group of scientists who knew about William and Mildred Wells and the kind of work that they did. And they said, wait a minute, it looks to us like COVID might be airborne, by which they meant that people could spread it to each other in the same way that, if you're across the room from someone who's smoking a cigarette, you wouldn't be surprised to smell smoke. That's because the smoke has made it all the way from them to you. And the fact is that when we exhale tiny droplets, some of which float, and they can float long distances. And if you're in a poorly ventilated space, they can float all around, and you can be on the other side of the room and inhale it. And those droplets, if someone has COVID, can contain the coronavirus. And, it took a long time for this debate within the scientific community to finally sort out. And then the World Health Organization went from saying COVID is not airborne. They explicitly said that in March 2020. About almost 2 years later, they said, okay, COVID can spread through long airborne transmission. So, it has had this living air around us has had a huge impact just in recent years. I mean, think about how much the world changed during the COVID pandemic and how it still changed because of the COVID pandemic. It was because of an airborne disease.
But the point behind this book isn't to sort of scare the living what's-its out of everybody who reads it and never want to leave their bubble sort of thing, because it is a field that I knew very little about, i.e. nothing about, but this is proving that there are living, organisms in the air that we breathe. And also it's part of, if you like, and I'm not going to get too deep and meaningless on you, Carl, but, the fact that this is the way that the world works. The planet has worked for this, it repopulates. I hadn't thought about how new islands get stuff on them. I was imagining a sort of fish flops up there and drops off a seed and it grows. It shows how much I know. But it is an area that perhaps we don't know that much about. So is this, if you like, an introduction to what is a fascinating and historical subject?
I would hope so. Yes. I mean, and, I very much, in the book, I am presenting, the aerobiome, not solely as something that could make you sick. And, because I want people at the end of the book to still feel like they can breathe, because we all have to breathe. And our ancestors have been breathing for millions of years. We are part of the aerobiome. We take these organisms into our airway. They're living inside of you. There are harmless or beneficial organisms that got into your body through the air. And so, we just have to sort of understand how better to live with the aerobiome, in the aerobiome. It's the same way with water. Certainly when microbiologists told everybody, hey, guess what? Water can contain bacteria that causes cholera or typhoid. Sure, that can be kind of scary, but that also gives you the knowledge that you can then use to live safely, to drink clean water. And now we have the knowledge to breathe safe air. We need to use that knowledge to live peacefully with the aerobiome.
The book is called Air-Borne. You'll be able to order it via our own virtual bookstore. Just click on the photograph and it will be winging its way to you. It is by Carl Zimmer. Carl, if people want to follow you online, where's the best place to sort of make contact and say nice things about you?
My website is carlzimmer.com, CarlZimmer.
The book is called Air-Borne. We'll be talking to Carl Zimmer. Carl, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.